I want to know how to close the loop on these beautiful kitchen scraps. How do I turn these into soil for my garden?
Right. Yes. So the biggest thing in terms of building a compost pile in kind of a more urban setting is you do want to collect a certain amount of materials, and it's usually the carbon materials that you're lacking in, because you're constantly generating food scraps in your house, especially if you're eating from your garden or you're eating, healthy in some way where you're cooking from scratch. So the one thing that you need is something like leaves, what a lot of people refer to in composting as your browns. So there are two types of materials when you're composting. You have your greens and your browns. And your browns are those mature, it's basically mature biomass. So think leaves, straw, cardboard, anything that's kind of woody and dry. Stalks from your garden and dried stalks from your garden are also considered browns. And then you have your greens, and in this case, it's just your kitchen scraps. But greens are also grass clippings, right? Fresh grass clippings. And you can use grass clippings just as long as you haven't sprayed your lawn with any herbicide. So collecting leaves in the fall is kind of key to having kind of an urban composting pile so that you have this material. And this is why this is such a perfect location in which to build a compost pile, is that you have these aspen here, and you can use these leaves as well as any leaves in and around your yard. But also, like, in the fall, there are always people that are raking up their leaves, right, and would happily have you take them away from them. So having a good amount of leaves to balance out your kitchen scraps is super important.
So in addition to materials, the greens and browns also need to find that perfect spot for it. And so it seems like there's a lot of options of containers or how to contain it. And we went with the idea that like a good free corner in the yard and then make some walls.
Yes.
So we found some pallets in the crawl space and
Awesome.
we made some walls. How else could somebody do that if they didn't have this amount of space or those types of materials?
Yeah, so you can, of course, I'm the biggest fan of what you have already, but that's why pallets are so great. You want to be able to access it easily for reasons that we'll talk about later, but you could certainly build it with pallets. There are some other composting bins that you can get. I would dissuade people from getting the turnable bins, that even though they look super convenient, what ends up happening is people just kind of throw their kitchen scraps in there and it becomes this kind of gross, soggy, putrefying mass of kitchen scraps rather than a functioning compost pile. But there are ones that you can buy that are plastic and or ones made out of wire that you can find online or at a garden center that I would recommend. What you want is something where the pile is continuous with your soil.
Okay.
That's the most, in my opinion, one of the most important parts. And then in terms of location, this is actually, Esther, this is a perfect spot, because one of the biggest things, especially if you're in a dry climate, and where we live, is that your compost tends to dry out really quickly. So you actually don't want it in the sun. You want it somewhere in the shade, if possible. And if you can't find somewhere in the shade, that you're at least kind of capping it with something to keep the moisture in. Right? So let's talk a little bit about the 5 elements of a compost pile. So we talked about the first one, which is food. So we want kind of a 50-50 mix of greens and browns. So again, the kitchen scraps are your greens, and the browns are all of this kind of mature biomass. One thing also to keep in mind with a kind of an urban composting setting, you're typically not putting meat in there, you're not putting fat or a lot of oils. If there's a little leftover pasta, you could probably throw that in there, but you're not putting a huge amount or a huge quantity of those things. So you're not putting those things in there. You're also not putting diseased material or mature weeds with seeds or dog or cat poop. So those are things that you want to avoid putting in your compost pile. Same with in terms of pine needles and stuff like that. You want this just to be maybe 10% of the pile, but and stuff like you know, ashes and stuff from a fireplace, if you have one of those, you want that to be kind of a 10% amount. But think, you know, in terms of your greens, like think about coffee grounds can go in there, tea bags can go in there. All of those things can be composted. And on the carbon brown side, toilet paper rolls, paper towels, you know, napkins, all of that stuff can be composted as well. So that's food. The second thing that you want to keep in mind is moisture. So you want your compost pile to be moist like a wrung out sponge. And that's what I was talking about in terms of having it in the shade so it doesn't dry out. And the reason for that moisture is that a lot of the macro and microorganisms that are breaking down the material need that thin film of water along which to travel. And so oftentimes when I see clients and their compost piles aren't doing anything, it's because, or they're static, it's usually because they're dry. So that's moisture. The other thing is surface area. So the smaller the pieces of material, the quicker they're going to break down. So that's surface area. The next thing is volume. So we won't have enough material today to build this up to what the ideal volume would be, which would be 3 cubic feet or up to 5 cubic feet. So the idea is that it needs to be a certain volume in order for the pile to heat up properly. So because you don't have that material, and because like in an urban context, right, or in a home situation, it might take you a while. What you'll do is you'll be kind of accumulating those materials, and once you get to that volume, that's when you'll be able to kind of have that fully break down. And then the fifth element, the last element, is you want this to be an aerobic with oxygen process, so air. So you need to aerate the compost pile on a regular basis. So people have probably heard of turning a compost pile. You're usually doing that ideally once a week, but people don't have time for that. So once the pile is built, right, it's probably more realistically you're turning it once every 2 weeks or something like that to introduce air into it. Usually when you're introducing the air and turning it, you'll also probably water it at that point in time. Now, of course, it depends on your location too. If you're in a location that gets way more rainfall than we do, then you may not have to do that. So it's always just testing the moisture level, moist like a wrung out sponge. So those are your 5 elements to a compost pile. And once you kind of understand those, you can also, that also helps you troubleshoot. Because if you don't have, say, enough air in it, then that's when things putrefy, and that's when your compost pile smells. A compost pile, if it's built right, shouldn't smell, right? If it's going through an aerobic process of decomposition rather than an anaerobic process, then it shouldn't smell. But if it's gone anaerobic, then that's when you get the odors. So those are everything that you should keep in mind. The first thing you want to do is probably put like just a layer of branches on the bottom. And again, this is that air part, right? We want this to be with oxygen, so there's going to be kind of a layer on the bottom that has a little bit of air. And then again, that element of moisture, as you're building the pile, you're watering it. So you're just watering it down, because you want to do it as you go so that the stuff on the bottom isn't still really dry. So one of your best tools is a garden fork for a compost pile, just in terms of moving material around and then eventually having to turn it. So let's put a little bit more water on that. So again, this constitutes a layer of browns, right? Layer of sticks for aeration on the bottom, a layer of browns, and then we'll do a layer of greens. You know, if you haven't chopped it up beforehand, this is when you would come in here and you would chop it up into smaller pieces so that it breaks down more. So you have a layer of greens, and ideally, you know, we'd probably put in this whole bit of greens.
And what's the ratio ideal between greens and
It's
browns?
like 50% greens, 50% browns.
Okay.
One thing that you could add here is a sprinkling of soil. And what that is it's inoculating the pile with microorganisms. Those microorganisms that are gonna start to break down your material. A sprinkling of soil in here just to add a little inoculant. Yeah, maybe just a little bit more. And then we'll start again with more browns. So you'll just continue to build this process, 50% greens, 50% browns, sprinkling of soil, water it down until you get to 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet. There is always an abundance of greens that people are generating in their households and or in restaurants or grocery stores or all of that kind of stuff. So there are ways to get more greens. And then once it gets to that 3 by 3 by 3, then you leave it, right? And then usually within 4 or 5 days, it'll probably heat up to like 140 degrees. And so there are thermometers like this, if you really want to nerd out on composting, which you can stick in your pile and they will monitor what the temperature is. And you'll see on the thermometer that it's active. It starts getting active. The compost pile starts getting active at about 120 degrees. But like I said, 4 or 5 days, it's probably up to 140. Maybe within a week, it might get up to 160 if you've built it right, if you've got those layers correct. And then after a week or a week and a half, then you want to turn it. And then maybe it'll need moisture. You want to check the moisture. At that point where you're turning it, you can add new kitchen scraps into the pile if you want to. But just know that at a certain point, you want to stop adding new stuff so that the whole thing can break down. So that's kind of the basics of composting. I think a lot of people, what ends up happening is it just becomes this inert pile of like decomposing things. Decomposition happens regardless of whether we participated in it or not. The advantage of participating in it is that decomposition can happen aerobically so that it doesn't smell, and it can happen quicker. And it's a great way, when you talk about why you should compost, one of the biggest, the stuff that goes to the landfill, one of the biggest components are kitchen scraps. And so if we can divert that material from the landfill, that's hugely beneficial. And of course, if you're a gardener, it's also closing the loop so that you can generate some of your own compost that you can then put on your garden. So that feels really good to be able to harvest stuff from the garden, eat from it, return some of those scraps back into this pile that's returned back into the garden. So it feels like there's a cycle that you're participating in, even on a very small level. So in terms of when you know your compost is done, right, so it will depend on how often you turn it. Sometimes it might be like a 2-month process, but your compost is usually done where it will have reduced by probably about 50%, and it looks like soil. There may be some coarse materials in there, but you're not seeing anything that looks like kitchen scraps anymore, right? It's just been decomposed down into this beautiful humus. So that's kind of use a little bit of your intuition and experience around, okay, what does soil, I think a lot of us know what soil looks like, but it's when those component parts no longer look like those component parts, and it smells good, and it looks good, and then you can use it in your garden.